The English Channel is just a very long, very shallow puddle. If you had stood on the white cliffs of Dover 20,000 years ago, you wouldn't have been looking at a gray, churning sea separating you from the rest of the world. You would have been looking at a valley. A massive, fertile, windswept plain of tundra and scrub, teeming with life and stretching as far as your eyes could possibly see. You could have gripped your spear, adjusted your furs, and simply walked to what we now call France without getting your ankles wet. But as you stood there, breathing in air that was crisp and dangerously cold, you wouldn't have felt like a conqueror of a new world. You would have felt like a guest in a home that was actively trying to evict you. This was the lived reality of our ancestors, a version of Earth that was geographically, biologically, and atmospherically alien to everything we consider permanent today. We treat the map of the globe as if it were carved in stone, but for the vast majority of human history, that map was a fluid, shifting sketch. To understand what ancient humans saw, you have to discard the idea of this stable planet you were born into. You have to realize that for 99% of our history, the Earth was a place where the horizons were wider, the nights were deeper, and the animals were large enough to treat a human being like a minor inconvenience. It was a world of impossible paradoxes. But this supposed stability of the solid ground was actually a grand illusion, because the very shape of the continents was a moving target. We often imagine early humans as being trapped on islands or restricted by coastlines, but for most of the Pleistocene, the oceans were simply not where they are now. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than the modern average. That's nearly 400 feet of vertical water that was missing from the basins, locked away in massive continental ice sheets. When that much water disappears, the map of the world undergoes a radical rewrite. In northern Europe, this created Doggerland, a sprawling landmass that connected Great Britain to the Netherlands and Denmark. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a heartland. Recent research led by Dr. Vincent Gaffney using seismic survey data has revealed that Doggerland was a complex landscape of hills, marshlands, and massive river systems, populated by thousands of people who called a place home that is now buried under the North Sea. To an ancient human, the idea of Britain as an island would have sounded like a frightening myth of the distant future. The same transformation occurred in Southeast Asia, where the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo were all connected to the mainland in a massive subcontinent known as Sundaland. In Australia, the lowering seas created Sahul, a supercontinent that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Even the crossing into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge wasn't a narrow strip of land. It was a 1,000-mile-wide territory called Beringia, featuring its own unique ecosystem of shrubs and grasses. The risk of these landscapes wasn't that they were hard to cross, but that they were temporary. A human living 65,000 years ago could have watched the coastline creep inland over the course of their life. This wasn't a slow geological crawl. It was a perceptible, persistent threat. If you didn't move, your hunting grounds didn't just change, they vanished. Yet, as much as the changing land defined their survival, the ground beneath their feet was actually a distraction from the truly terrifying transformation happening every time the sun went down. Today, we live under a dome of orange haze. Light pollution is so pervasive that nearly 80% of North Americans can no longer see the Milky Way. To a modern person, the night sky is a black curtain with a few bright holes poked in it. To an ancient human, the night sky was a three-dimensional explosion of light and depth. Without a single artificial photon to blur the atmosphere, the sky didn't look distant, it looked like it was pressing down on you. The stars weren't just points. They had colors, sapphire blues, deep oranges, and piercing whites. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smudge, it was a brilliant, textured river of silver and shadow that cast enough light to see your own hand in front of your face. But this beauty came with a profound psychological cost. In total, unpolluted darkness, your senses undergo a radical shift. Your peripheral vision becomes hypersensitive to motion, and your hearing sharpens to a degree that we would find agonizing. In the ancient world, night was a period of sensory overload. You weren't just looking at stars, you were listening to the void. Navigating this environment required a level of astronomical literacy that we've almost entirely lost. Early humans used the Bortle scale, level 1 darkness not for romantic reflection, but for precision navigation. Studies by researchers like Dr. Christopher Brooke in the field of acoustic archaeology suggest that ancient people likely used the positions of stars and the behavior of night-flying birds as a complex GPS system. They knew exactly how the sky rotated over their heads because their lives depended on knowing which direction led to water and which led to a cliff. The sky wasn't a decoration, it was a map, a calendar, and a constant reminder of how small they were in a universe that felt intimately, dangerously close. However, the overwhelming majesty of the stars was actually quite peaceful compared to the brutal reality of what was walking around in the dark right next to them. We think we know what big animals look like because we've seen an elephant at the zoo, but the Pleistocene world was defined by megafauna that make modern animals look like miniatures. If you were an early human in North America 15,000 years ago, you weren't just worried about wolves or bears. You were sharing the landscape with the short-faced bear, an animal that stood 11 feet tall on its hind legs and could run at 40 miles per hour. You were living alongside the glyptodon, a relative of the armadillo that was the size and weight of a Volkswagen Beetle, covered in bone armor and sporting a spiked tail that could shatter a human ribcage with a casual twitch. In Europe, you would have encountered the Irish elk, a creature with an antler spread of 12 feet. These weren't rare sights, they were the primary occupants of the planet. The sheer biomass of large animals was staggering. Recent fossil analysis from the 2019 study on Smilodon fatalis, the saber-toothed cat, suggests these predators weren't just solitary hunters but likely lived in social groups, making them a coordinated, multi-directional threat. The risk wasn't just being eaten, it was being stepped on, or simply being outcompete for every scrap of resources. To look at the world as an ancient human was to see a landscape where you were never the top of the food chain by default. You were a scavenger, a clever opportunist hiding in the cracks of a world owned by giants. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet aren't just art, they are survival manuals. They represent the obsessive, detailed observation of creatures that dictated every move a human made. Our ancestors didn't draw these animals because they were pretty, they drew them because they were the gods of the physical world. But those towering monsters were surprisingly fragile compared to the slow, silent death that could be brought about by a simple shift in the wind. We think of the Sahara Desert as an eternal wasteland, a sea of sand that has always been there, but that is a geographic lie. For a significant portion of human history, specifically during the African humid period between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was a lush, green paradise. This wasn't just a few patches of grass, it was a landscape of massive permanent lakes and rolling savannas. The largest of these, Lake Megachad, covered an area of nearly 140,000 square miles, larger than all the Great Lakes in North America combined. Ancient humans lived on its shores, hunted hippos in its marshes, and left behind harpoons and fish bones in places that are now some of the driest spots on the planet. Research by Françoise Gass in 2013 utilized fossilized pollen and diatoms to prove that this green Sahara was an interconnected network of rivers and vegetation that allowed humans to migrate across the continent with ease. But the paradox of the green Sahara was its instability. Because of a slight wobble in Earth's axial tilt, known as precession, the monsoon rains that fed this paradise were prone to sudden, catastrophic shifts. Over the course of just a few centuries, a lake the size of a small sea could evaporate, turning a homeland into a graveyard. This forced massive human migrations toward the Nile Valley, a movement of people that many historians believe provided the population density and social pressure required to spark the rise of ancient Egypt. The desert wasn't just a place, it was a process. To the people living there, the world wasn't a fixed setting. It was a character that could decide to stop providing for you at any moment. And yet, that constant struggle for survival was actually the only thing that gave their world a sense of order. When we look back at the Earth of 20,000 or 50,000 years ago, we see a place of grand scale and terrifying beauty. We see the mammoth-strewn plains of the Mammoth Steppe, an ecosystem that once spanned from Western Europe all the way across Siberia and into North America. It was the largest biome on the planet, a cold, dry, incredibly productive grassland that supported millions of large herbivores. Today, It is almost entirely gone, replaced by mossy tundra and boreal forests that are far less diverse. We see the massive glacial walls, some 2 miles high, that ground down mountains and carved out the Great Lakes. We see a night sky that would make a modern astronomer weep with envy. But we also see a world where humans were just one of many curious, struggling species. Ancient humans didn't have the luxury of nature as a concept because they weren't separate from it. There was no outside. To them, a cave wasn't a primitive dwelling, it was a strategic fortification. A river wasn't a scenic view, it was a life-sustaining artery and a dangerous barrier. Their world was smaller in terms of population, but infinitely larger in terms of experience. They traveled distances on foot that we find exhausting to drive. They knew the texture of every stone and the scent of every plant in their territory with a precision that we reserve for our most advanced technology. They were the most informed inhabitants the Earth has ever had, precisely because they had no choice but to pay attention. However, all that hard-won knowledge was ultimately powerless against the most fundamental change of all, the fact that they were watching their own world die. As the last ice age ended around 11,000 years ago, the environment didn't just change, it collapsed. The mammoth steppe vanished. The megafauna that had defined the human experience for 100,000 years went extinct in a geological heartbeat. The sea rose, drowning Doggerland and Sundaland and the Bering Land Bridge, swallowing the homes and graves of countless generations. The ancient humans who survived this transition were the ones who could let go of the world they knew and embrace a planet that was becoming quieter, smaller, and more predictable. They moved from the open tundra into the closed forests. They traded the hunt for the harvest. We are the descendants of those survivors, the ones who learned to live on a planet that had been tamed. We look at the map of the world today and see something solid and reliable, but that is only because we haven't been looking long enough. Our ancestors saw the truth. They saw a world of rising seas and falling stars, of green deserts and giants in the dark. They saw an Earth that was vibrant, violent, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. We think we have conquered the planet, but we have really just moved into the ruins of a much grander estate. There is a profound irony in our modern desire to reconnect with nature, because we are trying to reconnect with a version of the world that doesn't exist anymore. The Earth that built the human brain, the one that forced us to become clever, social, and imaginative, is buried under 400 feet of seawater and layers of glacial silt. When you look out at a modern landscape, you are seeing a sanitized, low-resolution version of the original. You are seeing the aftermath of a great thinning. Our ancestors weren't primitive people living in a simple world. They were sophisticated observers living in a world of staggering complexity and constant peril. They saw things we will never see, and they felt things we have largely forgotten how to feel. They were the witnesses to the Earth's most dramatic chapters, and their stories are still written in our DNA, in our instinctive fear of the dark, and in our inexplicable wonder when we look at the stars. We carry the memory of that alien Earth with us every day, even if we can no longer see it. We are the ghosts of a world that was too big to last, wandering through a landscape that has been hushed by time. Think back to that person standing on the cliffs of Dover, looking out over the valley that would one day be the English Channel. They weren't thinking about history. They were thinking about the movement of the herds, the scent of the coming snow, and the safety of their kin. They were perfectly adapted to a world that was about to disappear, and their success is the reason you are here today to wonder about them. We live in the quiet period between the storms, enjoying a stability that is the exception, not the rule. We have built our civilizations on the dry spots of a planet that is mostly water, under a sun that is mostly fire, during a brief pause in a cycle of ice that has been turning for millions of years. We treat this moment as if it is the way things have always been, but the Earth is a much older and more restless thing than our maps suggest. The world our ancestors saw is still there, waiting just beneath the surface of the water and behind the glow of our city lights. It is a world that doesn't need us, hasn't forgotten us, and will eventually return to claim the space we think we own. You are not the inhabitant of this world, you are its ghost. The view from a Paleolithic cliffside wasn't just a different landscape, it was a different reality, one where the boundaries between life and the environment were non-existent. We've spent the last 10,000 years trying to build a world that is the opposite of the one our ancestors saw, a world that is bright at night, quiet in the day, and geographically fixed. We've been remarkably successful at it, so successful that we've forgotten what it feels like to be a part of the Earth's actual rhythm. But that rhythm hasn't stopped, we've just put on headphones. Every mountain, every ocean, and every star is a reminder of the raw, unpolluted, and colossal world that once belonged to the mammoths and the people who hunted them. It was a place of terrifying beauty and absolute clarity, a world that demanded everything from those who lived in it. If you found this dive into our planet's hidden history fascinating, consider joining our community for more explorations of the deep past and the science that brings it back to life. It's a genuine privilege to share these rabbit holes with you, and there's always more to uncover. What part of the ancient world do you think you'd find the most difficult to handle? The absolute darkness or the giant predators? Let us know in the comments. The map you're looking at right now is a temporary lie.